For 5 years, Grace Monroe moved through the base like a shadow. She did her work, followed orders, and never gave anyone a reason to notice her. Most people assumed she was just another quiet pilot, someone who kept her head down and stayed out of the way. But that morning, something cracked. A high-level mission had gone sideways fast. Communication was breaking down, aircraft were under fire, and the control room filled with a rising panic that no one wanted to name. In the middle of that chaos, the doors opened. Grace walked in wearing her full flight gear, eyes focused, movements calm. She didn't flinch when the alarms blared or when voices shouted over each other. She said she needed access to the system. And this time, nobody stopped her. It was the moment everything shifted, though no one quite understood why just yet. People who had ignored her now stared. Commanders who once dismissed her now waited for instructions. There was something different in her voice, something final, something that didn't ask for permission. No one knew what Grace had been hiding. No one knew what it had cost her to keep it buried. But they were about to find out. And when they did, they would realize that the quiet woman they had overlooked might be the only one who could save them. Grace Monroe was the kind of person who passed through a room without drawing attention. At 38, she looked younger than her age but carried herself like someone who had seen more than most. She kept her dark hair tied back in a loose knot, wore her uniform clean, but never pressed, and never raised her voice above what was needed. She lived alone in the far end of the barracks, in a room barely personalized. A small photo frame sat on her desk, turned slightly away from view, and her books were stacked with quiet precision. She cooked her own meals, ran 5 miles every morning before sunrise, and always volunteered for the maintenance shift that no one else wanted. Most of the younger pilots thought she was just another mid-rank transfer, smart enough, but probably past her prime. She rarely joined them for coffee or late-night poker, and when she did, she mostly listened. Her words were careful, not cold, just measured, like she understood the value of silence more than most. There was something about her eyes, though, a watchfulness that never fully turned off. She would sometimes pause mid-step when walking across the tarmac, eyes tilted upward as if listening for something no one else could hear. Then she would move again, as if the moment had never happened. Grace didn't talk about her past, and no one asked. Some said she had once worked cybersecurity. Others said she had been benched after a failed mission. But when pressed, all anyone really knew was that she had shown up 5 years ago and never caused any trouble. She respected the chain of command and followed every protocol. Yet, there were moments when even senior officers seemed unsure how much authority she actually had. A few technical sergeants swore she once fixed a targeting array that none of the engineers could figure out. Another claimed she rewrote part of a mission plan overnight because she found a vulnerability no one else caught. But Grace never confirmed or denied any of it. She just smiled that small, patient smile of hers and kept going. People assumed she stayed quiet because she didn't have much to say. The truth was, Grace had already said more in her silence than most ever would with words. And while the rest of the base saw her as forgettable, the systems she once helped design were now part of every mission flown from those runways. Base Echo sat like a slab of steel in the Nevada desert, built for war and untouched by sentiment. Everything was concrete, wires, and classified silence. Even the air smelled like burnt jet fuel and tension. The buildings were gray, windowless, and lined with security checkpoints that buzzed with badge swipes and retinal scans. Inside, corridors stretched like veins through the compound, lit by cold fluorescent lights that never flickered. People moved in straight lines, clipped strides, eyes forward. Officers wore their ranks like armor. Orders came fast and without question. There was no room for hesitation or personality. This was a place where performance was everything and silence was mistaken for weakness. General Mark Dalton ran the base with the kind of discipline that demanded not just results but obedience. His voice cut through meetings like a blade. And when he entered a room, people stood taller whether they agreed with him or not. He trusted chain of command, trusted experience, and trusted himself more than any software or system. He didn't like ambiguity. He liked clean rules and predictable outcomes. Grace, with her quiet corrections and lack of explanation, didn't fit that mold. She wasn't insubordinate, but she wasn't deferential either. She spoke in complete thoughts and rarely blinked under pressure. Dalton kept her on the roster because she was competent, not because he understood her. He had no time for mystery, especially from someone who refused to market their intelligence. To him, Grace was a tool that had outlived its usefulness, and he was just waiting for a reason to move her out. The rest of the base followed his lead. The culture rewarded visibility and rewarded those who spoke loudest in the debrief room. Grace didn't. So, she was left alone. Not mistreated, just ignored. Innovation on the base existed, but only within narrow lanes. Anything too different, too fast, too outside protocol was seen as dangerous. Grace had once suggested a systems upgrade that was dismissed without discussion. When someone else brought it up 6 months later, slightly repackaged, it was accepted immediately. Even the younger tech staff who admired her didn't know how to help her voice be heard. She didn't play the politics. She didn't build alliances. She simply showed up, did her job, and left before anyone could drag her into meetings she had no interest in. The base ran on hierarchy, on clearance levels and seating charts and who saluted first. Grace lived in the cracks between those systems, present but unnoticed, brilliant but labeled as average. She didn't fight it. She just kept moving, always one step outside of the machine. No one questioned the structure, not until the day it all started to fall apart. And by then, the only person who had seen it coming had already been pushed aside. The operations room buzzed with preparation. Screens flashed live feeds and satellite scans, and voices traded coordinates in clipped tones. Grace stood near the back, arms crossed, watching the layout shift. She stepped forward, her voice low but clear. She pointed out a blind spot in the encryption interface, a pattern in the enemy's signals that suggested something adaptive. It wasn't fear in her voice, but certainty. General Dalton didn't look up. He waved off her concern without asking for details. Then he told her to return to her post and leave the thinking to those who were cleared for strategy. Someone near the monitors shifted uncomfortably. A junior officer glanced at Grace, then quickly looked away. No one spoke up. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or press the point. She stood still for a moment, let the silence speak for her, then turned and walked out. A guard met her at the door. Dalton had already ordered her clearance revoked from the operations center. She handed over her badge without a word. As she stepped into the hallway, the noise from the room faded behind her. The hum of the mission continued without her, just as it had been designed to do. She walked with calm, her face unreadable, her posture straight. No one ran after her. No one questioned the decision. She was a quiet woman in a world that listened to louder voices. But if anyone had been paying attention, they would have seen it. The slight tilt of her head, the way her hands stayed loose at her sides. Grace wasn't defeated. She was disappointed. There's a difference. The first warning came in a burst of static. One of the lead pilots reported resistance that didn't match the mission brief. Defensive turrets were shifting faster than expected, tracking aircraft like they could anticipate movement before it happened. Inside the command center, the atmosphere shifted. Operators leaned in closer to their stations, voices getting tighter. The radar feeds began showing erratic patterns, signals bouncing in strange loops. Then came the panic. A second aircraft called in damage, systems scrambled by something that wasn't supposed to be there. Their countermeasures weren't working. Whatever defenses this facility had, they were learning on the fly. Dalton stood with his hands locked behind his back, jaw tight. He ordered them to continue. Objective had not been achieved. Any sign of weakness, he believed, would embolden the enemy. The comms erupted. Pilots asked for guidance, pleaded for alternative tactics, anything. They were being outmatched. It was clear now. The enemy wasn't responding. They were adapting. One of the screens flickered, then went dark. A technician cursed under his breath. Another terminal lit up in red. Multiple aircraft were losing coordination, unable to hold formation. The AI defenses were breaking their rhythm apart. Still, Dalton refused to call retreat. He barked at staff to stick to plan. His voice grew louder the more things fell apart, as if volume could hold the mission together. In the back of the room, eyes darted toward the door. Someone whispered Grace's name, but no one moved to find her. The room was locked in fear and protocol. Every second stretched. The map showed aircraft falling into unpredictable trajectories. Fuel levels dropped. Systems strained. The mission was crumbling mid-air, and no one could stop it. Dalton paced near the main screen, teeth clenched. He still believed they could power through. That force would solve what foresight had failed. But no one else did. Not anymore. The people in that room weren't just watching a mission fail. They were watching the limits of their leadership fall apart with it. The doors to the command center opened without warning. Grace Monroe stepped in wearing full flight gear, her helmet tucked under one arm, her eyes locked on the chaos unfolding in front of her. The room froze. No one said anything at first. Voices died mid-command. She walked with quiet certainty through a space that had once dismissed her. The techs closest to the screens backed up, unsure if they should salute or stop her. Dalton turned, his face hard with disbelief. He started to speak, ready to have her removed again. But then the main screen crackled and lit up with the seal of the Department of Defense. The secretary appeared, surrounded by high-ranking officials and rows of silent faces. The secretary spoke without preamble, effective immediately. Grace Monroe was restored to operational command. All personnel were to follow her orders. No exceptions. Dalton tried to interrupt, but the secretary cut him off. He addressed him by name and told him flatly that Grace outranked him. Always had. A murmur rolled through the room. People looked at each other, then back at Grace. She stepped forward, calm and steady. She told them to pull up encryption diagnostics and adjust the firewalls. She listed off code names and protocols most had never even heard of. Dalton demanded an explanation. The secretary gave it to him. Grace Monroe was not just a pilot. She was the original architect of the encryption framework known as ShieldNet. The same system the enemy had now learned to mimic. The same system she once designed to be unbreakable. There was a beat of silence as it sank in. She had built the very language they were speaking in code. The defenses that were turning on them were twisted versions of her work. She didn't just understand the system. She had written it. Dalton's face went pale. His voice caught somewhere between protest and disbelief. The people in the room stared at Grace like they were seeing her for the first time. She didn't gloat. She didn't explain what she'd sacrificed to keep that role hidden. She simply took her place at the central console and got to work. Fingers moved fast across the keys. New maps appeared. Pilots began to get live data that made sense. One of the junior officers whispered to no one in particular. They said she'd been quiet all these years because she had to be. Because sometimes the only way to protect something that important is to disappear behind it. The base had treated her like a ghost. Now, she was the only one who could bring them back from the edge. Grace didn't hesitate. She moved to the console like it had always been hers. Her hands flew across the keys, pulling up encrypted files and bypassing systems most people didn't know existed. She activated a protocol none of them recognized, something she had built years ago, buried deep for a moment just like this. On the main screen, the digital map recalibrated. Symbols changed. Targets updated in real time. Pilots in the air began to receive new instructions. Vectors shifted. Defensive turrets started missing their marks. The hostile AI's response slowed just enough to create a gap. Grace adjusted the algorithm midstream. Her voice was calm over comms. No panic. No hesitation. She told them to follow the blue path indicators and ignore standard formation protocols. One pilot questioned the command. She replied with coordinates and split-second timing. It worked. The enemy's targeting systems hesitated, just long enough to let 3 aircraft reposition out of danger. The operations room held its breath. Dalton stood still, watching the feeds, watching her. His usual commands were gone. His authority had been pulled from under him, and no one asked for it back. Grace was leading, not through rank, but through certainty. Her knowledge was intimate, like she had built the machine they were flying against and remembered every weak spot it had, because she had. With each adjustment, the squadron grew bolder. Fear drained from their voices. They began responding faster, leaning into her instructions without second-guessing. One by one, the outer defense layers fell. The pilots called in clean strikes, data extractions, systems disabled, the feed cleared up, the red alerts began to disappear. The mission that had teetered on collapse was now moving with surgical precision. Grace ran the operation like a conductor leading an orchestra. Every decision exact, every second accounted for. People in the room who had never looked her in the eye before now followed her every move. The same quiet presence they had dismissed was now carrying them to safety. Dalton remained by the wall. His hands were at his sides, jaw tight, but his eyes never left the screen. The same woman he had cut out of briefings, denied promotion, and shoved to the margins, was saving his mission, saving his people. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. A technician called out the data extraction was complete. No casualties, no additional strikes incoming. Grace acknowledged with a short nod. She gave final instructions for regroup and secure return. On the screen, the last aircraft peeled away from the combat zone, following the exit path she had marked. The map went green. The danger was over. For a moment, no one moved. Then a quiet ripple of applause started in the back. Someone exhaled so loud it felt like a release of weeks of tension. Grace stepped back from the console. Her face showed no triumph, only focus, only the quiet weight of what had almost been lost. The mission was saved, but more than that, something deeper had been restored. The truth about who she was, and the reason she had been silent for so long. The room had mostly cleared. Only a few key officers remained, voices low, still absorbing what had happened. Grace stood near the main display, her eyes scanning the post-mission data with quiet precision. Dalton approached from the side. His steps were measured, slower than usual. There was no heat in his voice when he finally spoke, just a tired attempt to explain. He said he had followed protocol. He said he had no reason to believe. Grace didn't interrupt. She let him finish every word. When he finally stopped, she turned to face him fully for the first time. She said, his son, Connor, had died 5 years ago, protecting her during a mission so classified that even Dalton couldn't be told why. She said Connor had made that choice because he believed in what she was building, in what it would mean for national security, for people like the ones they just brought home today. Dalton looked like he wanted to speak again, but didn't. Grace kept going. She said she didn't hold anger, just disappointment, not for the demotion, not even for the silence, but for how easily he had dismissed something his own son believed in enough to die for. The command center was still, the hum of equipment the only sound between them. One of the aides looked away, pretending to check a screen. No one else moved. Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word landed with quiet weight. She told Dalton he had spent 5 years punishing the wrong person, and in doing so, nearly destroyed the very mission Connor had died to protect. Dalton said nothing. His shoulders didn't square. His voice didn't push back. He stood there, hands by his sides, caught in the truth he had refused to see. Grace nodded once. A small gesture. She turned back to the console. She had said what needed to be said, and that, finally, was enough. The investigation started with a timestamp, a file accessed during off hours, using credentials that hadn't been active in over a year. Grace and her team dug deeper, tracing it to a Pentagon terminal and narrowing it to one name that kept repeating in quiet corners of the data. Linda Foster. Foster had worked on threat assessments, low profile, nothing flashy. She attended meetings, took notes, blended in. No one ever questioned how she always seemed to be near projects tied to encryption and protocol review. Grace followed the money trail next. small deposits, offshore accounts. Each transfer timed within days of key mission briefings. It wasn't lavish. It was deliberate, clean enough to go unnoticed. Until now. They intercepted her at the airport. One bag, a burner phone, and a ticket to a non-extradition country. She didn't run when the agents approached. She just looked down and handed over her ID without protest. Back at the base, word spread fast. No one could believe it. Not Linda. Not the quiet analyst who barely spoke up during briefings. But the evidence was overwhelming. Foster had exploited a blind spot. Not in systems. In people. She knew no one would look at her twice. That invisibility had been her cover. She had sat through meetings and watched as Grace's influence, even in silence, touched every operation that mattered. She had followed that signal, picked the missions that mattered most, sold just enough to make a difference but not enough to draw alarms. It was slow, precise, and deadly. Grace watched the confession on a secure feed. There was no rage in her eyes, only clarity. Foster had studied her not to admire, but to exploit. The betrayal felt less personal than it did calculated. Someone in the room asked how long Foster had been feeding information. Grace said quietly, long enough to put lives at risk, long enough to make every second of her silence feel like it hadn't been enough. The truth had come out, not because someone shouted, but because someone listened, and followed the facts where they led, even when they pointed to one of their own. Grace stood quietly as the promotion was announced. The room filled with applause, and for once, every eye was on her without judgment. She had been named Brigadier General, and the title came not from politics, but from proof. She was offered an office at the Pentagon, a seat at the highest table, influence over national operations, the kind of position others spent careers chasing. But Grace didn't hesitate when she responded. She asked to be reassigned to the Air Force Special Operations Wing, not as an advisor, as its commander. She said that's where the work was real, where missions lived and died in silence, where her experience could matter most. The room paused, not because they disagreed, but because they understood. Those who had doubted her now nodded with quiet respect. Those who had followed her during the mission felt seen again. She wasn't choosing a smaller path. She was choosing one without ceremony, without speeches, where action spoke louder than command structure, where she could lead from the ground, not from a distance. The secretary signed off with a nod. No arguments, no questions, just a note of gratitude and a quiet acknowledgement that true leadership never needs to be loud. Grace left the building the same way she had entered it 5 years earlier, without fanfare, without a crowd, but this time, with a name fully her own, and a future shaped by choice, not circumstance. Grace stood quietly as the promotion was announced. The room filled with applause, and for once, every eye was on her without judgment. She had been named Brigadier General, and the title came not from politics, but from proof. She was offered an office at the Pentagon, a seat at the highest table, influence over national operations, the kind of position others spent careers chasing. But Grace didn't hesitate when she responded. She asked to be reassigned to the Air Force Special Operations Wing, not as an advisor, as its commander. She said that's where the work was real, where missions lived and died in silence, where her experience could matter most. The room paused, not because they disagreed, but because they understood. Those who had doubted her now nodded with quiet respect. Those who had followed her during the mission felt seen again. She wasn't choosing a smaller path. She was choosing one without ceremony, without speeches, where action spoke louder than command structure, where she could lead from the ground, not from a distance. The secretary signed off with a nod. No arguments, no questions, just a note of gratitude and a quiet acknowledgement that true leadership never needs to be loud. Grace left the building the same way she had entered it 5 years earlier, without fanfare, without a crowd, but this time, with a name fully her own, and a future shaped by choice, not circumstance.